Now I'm talking to Graham Robb at the Rimbaud and Verlaine event at King's Place. And I noticed tonight you're going to focus on the relationship between Rimbaud and Verlaine and their time in London. And I think it would be interesting just to have a little sort of mini version of this for our web archive.
Well, they had both already been to London together, and this was actually Rimbaud's third visit. And things were not going terribly well for Verlaine at the time, because he'd run away from his wife, run away with Rimbaud, and he thought he was also still in trouble for having been involved with the Paris Commune. And he was an alcoholic, so it was not an easy relationship. And Rimbaud was a very interesting point in his poetic development, if you can give it that grander term. I mean, he seems to spend most of his time working in the British Museum and seriously trying to learn English. And Verlaine wasn't nearly so focused as Rimbaud. Rimbaud was really trying to pull him into shape and get him to work on his poetry, which he eventually did. So Rimbaud was very good for Verlaine in that sense. But in the circumstances, it would have been impossible for any kind of relationship to survive.
Do you think London had any impact on what actually sort of came out in their poetic work?
Yes, I think it did. I mean, you can see there are references to London in both their poems that were written at this time. And you could also say that, they were both shocked and amazed by London, which is the biggest city in the world, nothing at all like Paris, and spent a lot of time exploring it. I mean, it's very difficult to say exactly what effect London had on their poetry, but both their poetry changed radically at the time they were in London and got out of that little literary world of Paris. Because, of course, in London, a lot of the time they were pretty isolated. Verlaine had a few friends and acquaintances, most of whom had been exiled from France. And Rimbaud only knew Verlaine. And a lot of people didn't really want to be seen to know them.
They're on a completely different tack. If you had to sell what their work had to offer to a modern audience who knew nothing about them, what would you identify? Not that I'm pooling them together, I can see they write very differently.
Well, it's interesting to use the word sell, because of course Rimbaud later became a very skillful salesman of guns and coffee in Africa. But he was never interested in selling his poetry, so it's very difficult to conceive of Rimbaud's poems as something that could be made attractive to an audience that might not otherwise be interested in them. I mean, most people discover Rimbaud by accident. You know, they're not necessarily at least in Britain, they're not, in America, they're not necessarily interested in his place in literature. I mean, he's a poet who, first of all, appeals to teenagers. I mean, most people who read Rimbaud as adults first read him when they were still quite young. And in fact, people who are more or less the age that Rimbaud was when he was writing his poems.
It's interesting, so they're sort of attracted to his kind of slightly angsty drive.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are drawn to him because they know that various other people they're interested in were attracted to Rimbaud, like Kurt Cobain and Bob Dylan and Patti Smith and so on. So he's part of that 20th century counterculture scene. I think that's how a lot of people discover him, in English or French.
I'm always kind of interested in the sense in which, you know, the academic and cultural world can take something on to another era and give it tremendous kind of relevance. I just would be interested to know how recognised they were at the time that they were alive in Paris and in the wider world.
Well, Verlaine had already had a good reputation as a poet when he met Rimbaud, and he knew a lot of journalists. You know, he was really part of that Parisian literary scene. Rimbaud wasn't known at all. He was known to maybe 20 or 30 people when he died, and didn't spend much time in Paris, certainly wasn't interested in making connections and making a career for himself. So Rimbaud really only became widely known in the 20th century. It was largely thanks to Verlaine. Verlaine, after Rimbaud's death, promoted his poetry. And in fact, even before Rimbaud's death, Rimbaud, who was in Africa by then, got wind of it and was horrified that someone was touting his teenage poems about.
I love it. Anyway, on that marvellous adolescent note, thank you very much.